yourself on. There you go. We would ask that you do keep yourself on mute to avoid any background noise. We will, after Walter's presentation, open it up for questions, and if invite you to make comments and questions in the chat as we go forward, or if you wish to ask questions directly using voice, that's also possible. So welcome to this evening's webinar on urban agriculture and the climate emergency. As I mentioned, Nick Rose, Executive Director of Sustain, the Australian Food Network. I'm joined by my colleague Georgia Carabas, Projects Coordinator with Sustain. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're coming to you from Naarm, the city of Melbourne, the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So it's a really terrific pleasure to be joined by Walter Jehne. Walter is a internationally recognised climate scientist, soil microbiologist, innovation strategist and keynote speaker, an extremely knowledgeable professional and practitioner in this area, and it's a great honour and privilege that he's taken some time out to share with us some of his wisdom over many years. I had the wonderful experience a couple of years ago, actually, at a Nutrisoil conference in Albury. I think it was 2018, where Walter was one of the presenters and held about 200 farmers spellbound for about 45 minutes. With a few coloured marker pens and a whiteboard talking about the A, B, C, D of soil carbon. And it was an absolutely fascinating presentation that I remember very well. So it's really wonderful that you're here with us this evening, Walter, and very much looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us. I should also mention that you are a director of Regenerate Earth, and you're going to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and Regenerate Earth as well. So over to you.
Yes, good evening, and thank you very much, Nick, and thank you everybody for joining in. And look, let's have a very interesting discussion. I can present a little about what we're talking about, urban agriculture in terms of the climate emergency, but also now particularly into the whole food futures situation. And then we can open it up for discussion, because it's your questions and answers to that actually is often the most valuable. As a bit of background in the sense that Nick asked, look, I'm a soil microbiologist. Initial part of my working life was as a research scientist with CSIRO, Division of Tropical Crops and Pastures, Forestry, Soils. But then I basically left there, worked a long time in government, looking at strategic innovation. How do we actually take our knowledge systems and actually apply them practically, commercially to get change? But 15 years ago, I retired and sort of formed a little group called Healthy Soils Australia, an NGO really driving this whole soil health, soil carbon story from the start. But now this has morphed into another organization called Regenerate Earth. It's an NGO, but it works globally, very much looking at now the practical application of this science, this knowledge, the experience from leading innovative farmers, and really addressing that challenge. What is it that we have to do? What is it we can do to regenerate Earth? And with that, of course, our climate, food, habitat, stability, futures. So that's really where we are. We work with a lot of people globally now. It's sort of really become quite exciting. And as we were just talking before, there's a UN Food Summit coming up in September. There's some initial programs and talks about that. But really, it's becoming very, very acute. Where are the solutions in nature? How did nature create this biosystem? How did nature sustain it? And what is it that we need to learn from that? Because these natural solutions are often now critical. And of course, today I wanted to very much focus on, where and how do we use those solutions in urban agriculture, and the role of urban agriculture in catalysing these changes. So basically, very, very pleased to join you in urban agriculture. I've been very much involved with that in Australia and globally, right from the early days with permaculture, actually back with Bill Mollison in the 70s. But certainly it's a very important area, and its time is really coming to the fore now. And so really, yeah, urban agriculture has mattered greatly, but perhaps more importantly, you matter greatly, because it's you, the innovators, as catalysts, as agents for change, that is really, really the driving point. This comes a little bit back into the whole crisis that we're in, because while we have a whole series of climate, water, food, biodiversity, all these different crises are looming, the real point is agency, isn't it? It's a case of, well, why have we been talking about them for 50 years, spending billions of dollars, having all sorts of meetings and modeling, but seem to be doing very little on the ground to make things actually happen and change. And so it's really, how do we empower grassroots agencies by people like you, the urban agricultural communities, those innovators, those passionate enthusiasts, because at the end of the day, they're going to be fundamental in making the change. Because we've wasted, in a sense, 50 years in certainly the climate emergency story, we're actually now facing a pretty critical situation. I mean, the COP26 meeting in Glasgow this November will still be talking about carbon accounting and aspirational emission reduction targets by different nations to get to negative or zero net in a way. But in a way, it's really gone way past that, because we're effectively locked into 4 to 6 degrees temperature rises globally on average under business as usual. But it's sad to say that basically just simply drawing down carbon dioxide or reducing emissions marginally is now far, far too late. We aren't going to basically avoid that climate catastrophe, and that's going to be happening in the next decades, just by managing carbon emissions or carbon drawdown even. Because the oceans, the world's oceans, contain 50 times more CO2 than the air, the atmosphere, and basically everything we draw out of the atmosphere will be re-equilibrated from the oceans, from that vast pool, that lag pool that the oceans contain. So the carbon dynamics is a very major buffered system, and quite frankly, we're not going to be able to basically stop climate change by just drawing down carbon. So effectively, we have to go back again to nature and say, look, how did nature naturally cool the planet? How does it regulate the heat dynamics of the blue planet? And can we learn from that? And can we re-engage and use those processes? And obviously the simple answer is that yes, we can, and yes, we must, because it's actually water, hydrology, that governs 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet. And basically by engaging and restoring those hydrological processes, yes, we can safely and naturally cool the planet in time. And that's all about rebuilding transpiration. It's rebuilding basically the latent heat fluxes from the transpiration. It's rebuilding cloud albedo cooling, and it's actually turning down the greenhouse effect directly, not by the amount of CO2 in the air that absorbs the re-radiated heat from the earth, but by actually turning down the amount of heat that's being re-radiated from the earth. Okay, so the greenhouse is basically the amount of heat going up, and then the percentage of that heat being absorbed by greenhouse gases, primarily 80% water vapor, 11% CO2. But the real determinant and our point of agency in the greenhouse is actually how much heat is being re-radiated from the earth, driving that greenhouse. And that is what we can turn down, again, by wise land management, by cooling the soils, because it's the actual temperature of the earth's soil that governs how much re-radiation goes up. So look, what I don't want to go into all the specific physics of climate change because we haven't got enough time for that, but really making the point that here is nature. It's naturally cooled the climate for 4 billion years through these hydrological processes. They're 25 times more, these hydrological processes are 20 times more effective than just the CO2 component of the greenhouse effect. And the answer is yes, we can understand and we can manage these hydrological processes to safely, naturally cool the planet. Okay, so that's in a sense the climate story. We can come back a bit into that a bit more with the Q&A, the question and answers, but I wanted to also raise two other critical crises issues, and that's in a sense the whole food security crisis, but also now with COVID, highlighted by COVID, is the whole question of the nutritional integrity of our food and therefore our preventative health. Because again, there's no point just saving the climate if, of course, our food systems and our preventative health and disease resilience is actually crashing as it is. So the question is perhaps more, not just urban agriculture, what does it, or how can we use it in climate, but where's its role in food security, food futures, nutritional integrity, and then our preventative health and our well-being on this planet. Okay, now basically what we're facing and what in a sense urban agriculture is going to be critical is in a sense avoiding the collapse of biosystems and of course with that their dependent communities. And this is another aspect of climate change, again to get into that. See, it's not just the CO2 concentration in the air that's the risky factor. In fact, you know, it'll take centuries for that to get to extreme levels as CO2, but it's in fact the dangerous hydrological climate extremes that are actually already accelerating, and they're the things that are impacting biosystems, whether it's through hurricanes or cyclones, floods, storms, droughts, aridification, or wildfires. And again, we're seeing these hydrological climate extremes impacting biosystems severely, accelerating, and it's with the loss of the biosystems that in a sense communities risk collapsing. And so this is happening now. It's not something 2100, it's something that's actually impacting now, and so we really have to come to address it. And so the whole issue becomes, how do we actually buffer and survive the biosystems we depend on against these dangerous hydrological extremes? And in a sense, this is where urban agriculture and of course the agency of grassroots communities on the ground becomes absolutely fundamental. And we're not going to get or be able to meet any of the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals to secure our safe future unless we look at this buffering of these extremes through grassroots activity such as urban agriculture. Okay, the other big thing is that we really have some very, very extreme time limitations. As I mentioned in the beginning, we've spent 50 years talking, modeling, talking, denial, delay, just more talk. And even in COP26 in Glasgow, we'll just have more talk, but up to now, very, very little action. And so really we've run out of time. And so it's now getting to this real crisis point of, all right, what is it that we can do as grassroots community to build the buffering, to build the security, but to do it now, practically, safely, and in time. So let's get into the question. So what role actually can urban agriculture play in terms of our food security? There are currently about 8 billion people on this planet, and basically we project some 10 billion to be here by 2050. But above that, some 70% of those 10 billions are projected to be living in urban concentration, cities. And of course, their whole existence is highly dependent on imported food, largely from an industrial food system, but also they're extremely vulnerable to the actual logistical security of that food chain. And as we've seen with COVID in the last 18 months, it can get very, very dangerously and upset. And so we're very dependent on actually a extremely fragile, subsidized, protected food system. And we saw in the Arab Spring that basically 7 missed meals, only 7 missed meals may actually separate social stability from chaos. And so what that's telling us really that we need to very critically look at our food systems. What sort of level of autonomy have we got? What level of integrity have we got in that food system? And actually, can we relocalize and secure the safe supply of that food? And so this becomes actually a very major priority. And urban agriculture, of course, is right at the front of addressing that crisis, that emergency situation. We all need about 2,400 kilocalories of energy food a day. We need about 50 to 100 grams of protein per person per day, but we also need about 50 essential nutrients and cofactors. And of course, these have to come from our food. And so really, what is the best way of securing those? And in a sense, urban agriculture, as was common up to the Second World War, was really the key means that we could secure that. You had urban situations, for example, Paris in the 19th century, that had an exquisite food system, highly sustainable, highly nutritious, basically growing that food in a peri-urban, urban agricultural setup around Paris, all the farmland, and being a very resilient, autonomous, healthy food setup. And so rather than depending on what we've got now, which is a $10 trillion a year global industrial food system that can't deliver and is fully dependent on subsidies and protection and externalized consequences, can we go back to this much, much more resilient, much more autonomous, much more sustainable urban food ecology as we had in the 19th century? And I use the example of Paris as a case. And if we do, then actually there's enormous potential benefits, because quite obviously everybody needs to eat. So we're importing a lot of food from outside the city, but of course all those nutrients are then excreted in our waste. And so these cities are actually gold mines of actually nutrients. They're nutrient sinks. And of course, if we use those nutrients and cycle them very intelligently, we have already in the cities a basis of sustaining viable agriculture, healthy food systems, healthy people, disease resistance. Conversely, of course, if we don't manage those excrements, those effluents wisely, then we end up with pandemics and enormous disease consequences, as we had early in the 19th century, you know, city after city collapsing, cholera, typhoid, what have you, because of that lack of waste management. So the point is that basically we can actually use the strength of cities to say, look, here are very, very high quality nutrient sinks. And if we efficiently cycle those through urban agriculture, we can, in a sense, address those food needs and the health needs of that community very, very successfully. So really, it's this risk of basically 10 billion people on the planet, 7 billion in cities, running short of food, being dependent, vulnerable, yes, we can address those problems through redesigning urban agricultural systems at scale and efficiently cycling those nutrients. And as we've touched upon, if we can do that, then of course we can actually rebuild, restore the nutritional integrity of our food and therefore of our actually preventative health disease resistance. This is very significant because at the moment, while we've got basically 1 billion people or 800 million people that are hungry, we've got about 2 to 3 billion people that are obese already. But more than that, we've got up to 5 billion people who are, in a sense, subclinically malnourished. You know, we get a lot of carbohydrates, we got a lot of sugar, starch, fat, salt. We're getting a lot of that in our industrial food, but we're often extremely malnourished and deficient in some of the 50 essential nutrients, trace elements, cofactors that we need for our health. And in a sense, that's actually creating our vulnerability to disease. And work way back in the 50s by Linus Pauling and others, biochemists, they just defined very clearly that up to 90% of our preventative health was associated with our nutrition, you know, the nutritional integrity of the food and whether we were getting the essential nutrients we needed for our enzymes, for our cofactors, because these are the things that control and give us our resilience to disease. Certainly in the 19th century, cities were enormously impacted by bacterial diseases, these pandemics because of unsanitary conditions. We largely overcame that through engineering, safe water, safe sanitation systems, but there's still about 1,200 virus diseases that can severely affect humans, and they're still in our environment. And the only way we can actually manage those sustainably is actually through the epidemiology of infection, but secondly, then our innate preventative health resilience to those infections. And this is where our nutritional integrity and our preventative health is critically important. And the point is, urban agriculture, by providing local, high nutrition integrity food, can be extremely valuable in reinforcing that preventative health and then managing those pandemics and those viral disease consequences. So this is very topical, of course, because obviously we now have COVID, and yes, it's a very serious viral disease, but the big question is, what sort of infections will we get? What sort of mortality will we get? What is our preventative resilience, not just through vaccines, but actually in our own biochemical health? And in a sense, what role can urban agriculture and high nutrition foods play in reinforcing that resilience? Okay, so basically, again, urban agriculture in terms of crises facing humanities, this whole long-term future disease resilience, especially when we're going to have 7 billion people living in cities, fairly crowded together, that urban agriculture becomes extremely important and is a key point for their health and future. The other thing that, in a sense, we have to look at, and where urban agriculture, again, has an enormously powerful role, it's not just climate crises, it's not just food crises, it's not just, in a sense, health crises, but it's also this whole question of social equity, social empowerment, and social stability. Again, by 2050, we'll have 7 billion, mainly young people living in cities. And unless they have that equity, those opportunities, the jobs, the income, the independence, the self-empowerment, we're going to have serious social, instability, disenchantment. And again, urban agriculture is extremely important in overcoming that sort of crisis socially, because more than anything else, it is wonderfully empowering. You know, the agency that people exercise by growing their own food, establishing local eco businesses in food distribution, food value creation and capture, and basically making that food available on an equitable social basis is absolutely profound in reinforcing the well-being of that community, but also, of course, those individuals. So I'd suggest that the limitation in the next 30 years will be effective, meaningful jobs and meaningful purposes to a lot of those 7 billion young people. And so urban agriculture, by providing, in a sense, not just food and activity, but providing jobs and meaningful employment, becomes an extremely valuable social catalyst, social driver. And of course, if we can do that, then of course cities, and urban agriculture is part of it, can be a catalyst for enormous amount of creativity, innovation, efficiencies, cycling, as these eco businesses get established and basically a community functions better. So these social empowerment factors are actually really critical to rebuilding a viable food ecology for our cities and our communities in the years, decades going forward. The other strong thing is, of course, at the moment, as I mentioned, we've got a $10 trillion a year industrial food system globally. And that can only survive because it externalizes most of its consequences. And of course, it's got protection and subsidies from the taxpayers through all sorts of legal subsidies and what have you. And of course, economically, that's no longer sustainable. We can't actually perpetuate these externalities, you know, the soil degradation, the water pollution, you know, the natural capital losses, and we can't sustain the actual subsidies. And so if we withdraw them, we're going to say, well, where are we going to grow our food and how do we maintain social stability without them? And again, urban agriculture is really a fundamental lifeboat and solution to this social crisis. So whether it's climate, whether it's food, whether it's health, whether it's the social stability, I mean, urban agriculture has an enormous future role to play. So the issue is, yeah, how do we make this happen? You know, how do we actually drive this urban agricultural change at scale everywhere on the planet? And of course, if we go back to nature, which is where all the solutions are, in fact, then it's very simple, because by simply growing plants using photosynthesis, we can actually supply more than enough of the food we need, more than enough of the biomaterials we need. But of course, plants, you know, photosynthesis, it just involves a simple process of taking CO2, water, and sunlight and using it to fix carbon to make biomass. But to do that, photosynthesis or plants need water and nutrients. And these water and nutrients are normally available through soils. The stardust from 4.6 billion years ago that, in a sense, the planet is made of. And so it's actually the availability and access and ownership and quality of our soils that becomes the cardinal, not just limiting factor, but the actual point of physical, again, agency and improvement that we can effect. And basically the question is for urban agriculture, well, how do we do this? And from having worked for a long time with communities all over, or rural communities all over the world and stuff, especially in urban agriculture, and I've just got this little overhead here. Now I hope you can see it, but it's really the diagram that...
Move it a little bit more to the other side, Walter.
This way.
Yeah,
No, this way.
No, the other way.
Yep. Okay, and so what this is really is what we call a little wicking bag, right? And this is 70 centimeters by 70 centimeters cubed, just a bag out of recycled waste plastic, which basically we can have a layer at the base where we actually have water in a plastic liner as a reservoir. And so basically this is a soil container with inbuilt water accessibility, which means that you can only have to water it once every month or so, right? So it's not dependent on water, but more importantly, that water is used by the plants in your wicking bag. At the moment in urban agriculture, some 80–90% of the water and nutrients that we put onto our gardens are actually cannibalized and stolen by the roots of plants and the mycorrhizal fungi of those plants growing, trees and what have you growing nearby. So we're lucky to get 20% of the nutrients and water used by the food plants we're growing. But these wicking bags, because they are separate and above the ground, actually give us that autonomous, in a sense, microcosm where we can grow food without losing this water either as leaching or as theft by these other plants. We can also, because all this watering is coming from below, from this wicking layer, we can use grey water to actually irrigate this. And of course, that encourages deep roots to that water layer because we're not watering it from the surface, we're only watering from below. So this is encouraging good prolific root growth to depth and of course, healthier plants. It also avoids weed growth in that sort of situation, particularly because, particularly if we can also mulch that surface. So we're reducing evaporation, reducing weed competition, but actually getting very, very resilient, efficient water use in these plants because we're not losing the water, but also all of the water we're adding is being used by the plants. In fact, these wicking bags, they can have a 10-fold water use efficiency relative to a standard garden bed. The other thing these wicking bags do, of course, they can basically be an in situ nutrient cycling system. So what we have here is a worm tube that is incorporated into each of these wicking bags. That's simply a bucket, a plastic bucket that's upturned, dug in. And of course, into that we add organic waste scraps from the kitchen and what have you. And of course, this is encouraging worms that are proliferating throughout the soil to break down that added compost, added waste every day and redistribute that through the soil in their castings. And so we're having actually a in situ continual nutrient cycling and nutrient enrichment system, effectively composting in situ through these worm tubes and these vermiculture activities. So not only have we got a very tight and efficient water system, but we create a very tight nutritional cycling system because all the waste scraps from the food is basically returned directly back to the soil and within days reincorporated back into the soil to maintain a very nutritious environment. We can also, of course, have a small greenhouse canopy over each of these wicking bags, and that allows us to, in a sense, maintain a 365 days a year, in a sense, habitat to sustain the growth of these plants. And so what we're then doing is actually just continually growing food plants in these wicking bags, supplied with this water, supplied with these nutrients, protected from competition in a conducive environment. And basically these beds or these wicking bags then end up with highly productive, sustainable food systems. The powerful thing about them, though, is that, and this is quite radical and quite unique, that these things are, in a sense, above the ground. They can be moved around, but they are also sovereign soil. In a sense, we're making these new soils out of waste materials, old degraded soils, subsoils, and basically waste organic matter, waste water. But the point is they are sovereign in the sense that they are owned by the farmer, by the gardener, by the children, whoever are looking after them and making them. So in a sense, for the last 8,000 years, the whole of agriculture has been based on land ownership. Who owns the land, and therefore land has become a limiting factor to humanity to grow food, because not everyone has access to land. Whereas now we're saying with these wicking bags, we have sovereign soil. We have soil that belongs to the grower, and then as they produce more, they can actually get ever more productive. So they're actually growing their own healthy soils, and that soil becomes their soil. And so we're breaking that whole 8,000-year gap and limitation between, who owns the soil and who can farm. Now, these wicking bags are made out of obviously recycled waste plastic. We can show you, there's details of how to do that. And so the whole future in urban agriculture, and not just urban agriculture, but also village agriculture and a lot of basically developing situations, is that basically if we can give people these wicking bag systems, then they can have this water use efficiency, they can have this nutrient efficiency, they can have this sovereign soil. And so with that, really empower themselves to look after their whole food and nutritional future security in a very positive, benign way. The ideal is if we could give every child over the age of 5 a wicking bag for every one of their birthdays till the age of 12 to 15, then by the age of 15, everybody will be able to be producing more than enough food from half a dozen to 10 of these wicking bags, more than enough green food to keep their nutritional needs and health intact. So what I'm saying really is it's not just a matter of urban agriculture is important, but we need to now urgently increase it at scale. We've got to urgently more or less address the challenge that we've always had. Can we grow enough food in these urban ecological systems to meet the needs of the communities, the 7 billion people that'll be in those urban areas? And the answer is yes, we can, because it's these sorts of innovations, simple, practical, very cheap, very reliable systems like these wicking bags that in a sense are there to empower us to meet that food security, meet that nutritional integrity requirement for humanity in the years forward. So I'll just switch back to myself, not that I'm so good to listen to or look at, but the point being that these wicking bags really become powerful enabling tools for urban agriculture to go into the future. And basically, we see these wicking bags actually and urban agriculture as really a critical social revolution for the future. Because if we can do this at scale, and we can, every balcony, every courtyard, every garden, every nature strip can have these sorts of food growing systems. We have all the knowledge we need in terms of growing food and what have you to do it. And basically with these systems, that knowledge, we can actually regrow healthy soils to feed humanity, to meet our nutritional and our health needs, and to give social empowerment in these through these urban agricultural systems all over the planet in the next decades. At the moment, some 70 to 80% of the food that people eat are actually already grown largely by women in gardens and village agricultural situations. So when people say, no, we can't produce enough food in these small scale ecological systems, that's disregarding that performance, which often doesn't feature in the data, but it's also basically assuming that we have to grow as much food as the industrial system does at the moment, when in fact 70% of the food that's grown by the industrial system gets fed to animals, not to people, and of the food that's grown, up to a third or more is actually wasted at different stages in the process. And as we've shown with these wicking bags, effectively there's no waste because everything is into a very tight cycle. So overall, the bottom line is, yes, we can actually meet our food needs. Yes, we can meet our preventative health needs. Yes, we can revitalize local urban economies, communities, and stabilities. And yes, by doing this, we can actually massively re-empower that grassroots base by re-engaging or regenerating these hydrological processes, these urban agricultural hydrological processes. We can also very directly and rapidly help to cool the planet, because simply by keeping soils cooler and reducing that re-radiation of infrared heat, which drives the greenhouse effect, we can actually turn that greenhouse effect from high to simmer, irregardless of how much CO2 is in the air. Okay, by increasing the amount of green transpiration, plant cover, every gram of water that's transpired by plants takes 590 calories of heat energy from the surface back up into the air and then largely out to space, cooling the planet. So by re-greening these urban situations, by empowering urban communities, or the majority of the humanity, to basically be back into this urban agriculture, we can actually significantly and rapidly not just meet our food needs, but cool the climate. The bottom line, of course, is time, that we have to do this in the next decade or so, before the dangerous hydrological climate extremes that are already collapsing and impacting biosystems prevent us from doing so. The bottom line is we have this solution. Effectively, we're standing on it. It's our soils. We are the solution. It's in our own hands. We can do it. So basically, it's just a simple question of, yes, go and do it. Enjoy it and be well. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Walter. That was wonderful. That was a fantastic journey from the dawn of the age of agriculture through. Sorry, I'll just put my video back on. Through Paris, through to the industrialization of the food system in the 20th century, and to the crisis that we face now, and you've, I think, really reminded us all of the solution is very much within our grasp. It's very, very possible. So I'm sure that people will have comments and questions. Anyone who wants to say something, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask Walter a question or make a comment. Maybe let us know who you are and where you're joining us from. Who would like to speak? I'm sure there must be some comments after that presentation. That was absolutely fantastic. Who would like to some comments coming through from Canberra? Yeah, sorry, Matt. Yeah.
Yeah, good day, Walter. I met you down in South Australia at Deep Winter.
Yep. Remember it well, Willunga.
Yeah, it was excellent down there. We run an urban farm in Brisbane, and we've been running it for probably 6 years now. And what we find difficult is actually to produce food that is nutritious for people. So a range of food, but also be able to make enough money from it. Do you think that we need subsidization in urban agriculture or not?
Okay, look, thank you. Very important question. And yeah, this is why I think having the discussion is so valuable, right? Look, at the moment, it's very, very difficult because, yes, you're pioneering and you're not getting recognized for the values that you're producing. And I didn't go into it in enough detail, perhaps, but see, the whole issue is by growing food, in a sense, in these natural processes, their nutritional integrity is far higher. Our industrial food now has perhaps 1/3 of the nutrient concentration and often 0 of the essential 30+ trace elements we need for our biochemistry, our enzymes, our health. But that's all being disregarded because they're just selling food on a weight basis. And food shouldn't be sold on a weight basis, it should be sold on a values basis. It's value in terms of health, it's nutritional integrity. And so when basically we realize that basically it's not just a $10 trillion a year industrial food system, but that $10 trillion industrial food system drives a $20 to $30 trillion a year industrial disease industry. And that disease industry is driven by food which hasn't got the nutritional integrity that it formerly had before the Second World War. Then that $20 trillion becomes something that we can actually save through providing healthy food. Okay, so at the moment, I mean, look at the 10 trillion. At the moment, farmers get about 2 trillion of the 10, but of the 2 trillion, they're paying 1 and a bit trillion for inputs into industrial agriculture. So they're basically working on 7-8 cents in the dollar. So, you know, $800 billion, if you like, out of that 10 trillion. But if the value of your food is recognized properly, then the savings in health costs should come to you. And so it's really a question of basically how do we communicate and make people aware that their health, their children's health, is totally dependent on the food they eat. Goes back to the Greeks, isn't it? Let food be thy medicine. And basically, once they know that, and once they know where to go to and recognize healthy, locally grown food, then they'll be more than willing to spend their dollars not on disease costs, but on healthy food. And that's the change that we have to catalyze. That's the awareness we have to bring about. But that's in a sense where we have to talk to the community, because it's actually people voting with their dollars every time they spend their dollars, particularly on food, that decision is going to be made, right? Do I buy this quality food because of its health value, or do I compromise my health and take the pain and the cost of health consequences? There's no question at all, like in Australia, we're only spending about 8% of our GDP on health. In America, it's about 17%, and they only cover half the population. And so we're not going to be able to sustain this disease industry and this compromised food system for much longer, no matter how much subsidy and protection and externalization, policy puts into it. It's going to have to come back into healthy food, and healthy food comes from healthy soils. And the key thing to providing that healthy food is, in a sense, again, it's another talk, in fact, it's quite a big subject. It's the actual mycorrhizal nutrient uptake processes of healthy grown foods. And they're completely different biochemical processes than what's happening in our industrial hydroponics that most of our food is grown in now. It's a selective, intelligent uptake across the fungal membranes of the nutrients that the fungi needs, that the plant needs, that we need. And it's the concentration of essentials, the exclusion of toxins through this intelligent quality control interface, which are the fungal hyphae, And that's what governs the nutritional integrity. And you only get that in a sense, ecological, soil-based, organic, natural food systems. You don't get it in industrial agriculture because those fungi have all been killed. So look, there's another whole big story and lots of detail, all substantiated science. There's no question about that. But basically at the moment, you're getting shortchanged because you're growing far superior food, but you're just getting commodity prices for it. And even then you're being taxed to subsidize the disease industry that's covering up for the compromised food.
Thanks, Walter. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much. That and thank you for really kind of like so clearly explaining the absolute fundamental importance of soil-based food production and the difference between that and hydroponics. And maybe we'll have you back if you're willing, Walter, for another session to go into mycorrhizal fungi and dive a bit deeper into that.
Totally. Look, Nick, and this is a Pandora's box. No, look, there are so many avenues. It's a bit like a root system. You can go down any branch, and it's another wonderland, right? So yes, I just simply say that look, we're only touching the surface, raising these issues. All the detail is there. I mean, like we're talking preventative health. As I mentioned, that was Linus Pauling, 4 Nobel Prizes 70 years ago. 90% of preventative health is all about the nutritional integrity of the food we eat, right? And yet, where does that appear in our industrial ecology?
That's right. And that's certainly a case that we're trying to make to the federal government and all state governments for a much greater investment in urban agriculture, really, to really heed your call and say to, politicians and policymakers across the country that, for the reasons you've mentioned, this is essential. It's a necessary investment in our health and in dealing with the climate, as you've so eloquently explained tonight.
Yeah. And I suppose, I mean, I've worked with politicians a lot. And so the question really is asking for money for urban agriculture or regenerative agriculture is one thing. Now, if you sort of say, look, I can give you these billions of dollars a year in saving in disease costs, health costs, and let's do a profit share on that. You invest X% of the savings to get the savings, right? Then that's the sort of business proposition that they respond to.
Absolutely. Okay. We've got another question coming. Representative from the Food Embassy. Would you like to?
Yeah, it's me, Nick. Hi.
Hi.
It's Liz here.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Walter. That's fantastic. I'm actually in Wollonga. So,
oh, right.
Yeah. And I have the fabulous Village Greens as my local urban farm just up the road that you probably spoke with, I'm sure, those guys when you were here. Just what you said then was amazing. I'm actually working in the space of doing the communication to the public around how important it is that we're supporting our urban farmers and why we need to eat this food. I guess one of the challenges for me is food is really way too cheap. And, the common thing that drives most of people's food choice is cost. And so that's what I constantly have to grapple with when people were saying to me, but Liz, I just can't afford it. And so there's this, this real challenge of how we work in that space. And I'm doing a lot of communication and a lot of education in it, but again, often talking to those who are already converted and already supporting it. So yeah, I don't have it. I just, wondered if you had any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, look, you're right. And in a sense, it's not just a matter of cost, it's a racket, right? Deliberately so. Now, the fact is that the industrial food systems get massive subsidies, right? It's a massive protected thing. Australia is not the worst, of course, but overseas it's just obscene. And most of it is in actually externalized costs and consequences, right? Like we're saying with these $20 trillion plus of health or disease costs, right? It's just externalized to the public, to the taxpayer, to the future. And the same goes with all the other subsidies. I mean, in the US, they've got $1 trillion farm bill, right? Which is subsidizing industrial agriculture. The little guys don't get into it because of, compliance criteria. And most of that money, 95% of that money goes to the big end of town. So what I'm getting at is it's these subsidies that allow them to dump large volumes of food very, very cheaply on the market. Well, large volumes of very cheap food very cheaply on the market, deliberately to undercut your viability, right? Because you, with that sort of income, can't sustain small farms. And so again, you've got to get out of selling raw food and to say, no, I'm selling health and much higher values. And so, yeah, rather than just selling a carrot, can I go in to sell meals, or can I sell, something higher up the value chain? But also understand that you're in a loaded game being used deliberately to, or being squashed down deliberately through these externalities, these subsidies. And yes, we have very cheap food, but it is cheap in more ways than cost.
Absolutely. It's all that hidden cost, isn't it? Hidden to the environment and to health.
It's all that hidden cost. And of course, we're paying through that. We're paying for that in our climate, in our degraded soils, our degraded water, our vulnerability to things like COVID, etc. Right?
Yeah. And I think it's the majority of people really just do not understand that at all.
No, they don't. But then on the other side, like if you individually ask people, like what's the most important thing you can do with your discretionary dollar? And they'll basically come very clearly, yes, my children's health, the family's future. So there's no question that they're ready to vote with their dollars for nutrition and health if they could understand how significant it was and what a racket they're in.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Liz and Walter. Fiona, you had a question. Would you like to just maybe say who you are and what you're doing in Canberra, and your briefly what your kind of dream is, and then your question for Walter.
Oh, thanks, Nick. So, hi, Walter. It's Fiona here. I got a Churchill Fellowship last year to look at urban farm ventures that provide vocational training.
Yep.
And I love, we've heard you talk before at Maloon, and it's really great to hear you speak. How do you think it's best to get this message across? Because with the people that I'm working with in Canberra, there's a lot of people that believe urban agriculture is all this high-tech indoor stuff that is hydroponic and producing very nutrient-poor food. So what's your advice about how we kind of get this message across, and the fact that we can use urban agriculture to solve more than one problem? Like, that just seems so appealing.
Yeah, look, and it comes back to the previous discussion a little bit, isn't it? It's actually just forcing the reality on the balance sheets, like saying, look, these are the real costs of what you're doing now. These are the real consequences. Let's have valid accounting so that all those costs are in there in the comparison, and really just putting it to government, but also the people who, in a sense, vote in the government, to say, you're actually protecting and subsidizing and harming yourself in this system, right? And that's the first thing, is just making that blatantly clear that everybody understands that. And the next thing is, look, just doing it. I agree that as pioneers, it's a struggle and stuff, but basically the more viable eco businesses, urban agricultural setups that are created and are functioning and getting premium prices and getting resilience, which is actually a big, I'll mention in a second, that really then, these are the case studies or role models that say, yes, we can do it. Talking about resilience, climate change, it's in a sense a double-edged sword. The conventional farmers, because of climate extremes and unreliability, even with massive inputs, are now often in a situation where they used to get 4 crops out of 5, now they're getting 3 or 2 out of 5 because of that variability. Whereas when you have a buffered, resilient natural-based system, yep, you're still able to carry on and get the 4 out of 5. So like in WA, we had lots of things where, look, the wheat crop goes down one year with frost, the next year with no drought and what have you. And so people are losing crop after crop because of these extremes, whereas the natural, resilient plants, they're still maybe not producing the bumper crops, but they're still producing more than enough yield to, to get an income, if often a better income, because then there's not so much food flooding the market and the price is a bit higher. So basically, I think it's case studies of, here are these innovative farmers being successful because of this resilience, because of their full accounting, but then also putting the full accounting of subsidies and protection to the public and to the politicians, and saying, look, this is no longer viable. We've got to change.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Walter. Keep up the good work.
Oh, no, it's you that are doing the work. I just talk.
Yeah, but it's great talk.
Certainly is. Yeah, thanks
no,
very
we do
much,
a lot more than talk, actually, but that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fiona. Have we got another question or comment? I think we can sort of go for maybe another 10 minutes, if that's all right with you, Walter.
Yeah, no, perfect. Yeah.
I've got another question, Walter.
Yep.
Is there any good statistics on how much, say, energy, chemicals and things like that per acre that urban agriculture saves compared to industrial agriculture?
Look, absolutely. And I mean, while you have to look at each situation, of course, and it'll all vary, but this is exactly what we're talking about with the accounting, right? Like, if you're looking at proper valid accounting, you've got to take all that embodied energy, all the subsidized energy input costs, and you've got to properly account for them. And then you do the balance sheet, right? And then you do that valid comparison. At the moment, obviously, they're just claiming credits or they're claiming outputs, but all the real costs, the hidden costs are all externalized. And that's in a sense what externalization does. Everything is on the taxpayers, our children's, the future's credit card, not actually in the accounting for that product. But it's enormous, right? I mean, basically, to make ammonium nitrate, for example, takes an enormous amount of energy to transport it, more energy to put it into the ground, again, more energy. And guess what? Then 80% of it volatilizes or leaches and pollutes the environment significantly. And that's, again, costing more. So there's negative on negative on negative. But of course, everybody always says, oh, look, I got a 20% yield response on a weight basis from using it. And aren't I wonderful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. And so it's really, again, I mean, it's just, talking the truth, documenting the truth. It's all there. And yes, you can go to every situation and do that. But at the same time, you've got to accept, don't accept it, but the reality is, yes, you are in a sense in a pioneering position and the status quo is protected. So for a while, you've got to say, look, okay, how do I keep functioning, even though it's a loaded game? And you can do that by, niche marketing, and then saying, can I move up that value chain so I don't even try to sell things on a competitive commodity basis, on a tonnage basis. Whatever you sell, you're selling to somebody who values why yours is better.
Yes, it's that direct relationship, isn't it? And building that understanding and really building a community and raising levels of consciousness ultimately, which is I think where you were going, Walter, talking about the the radical and even revolutionary potential of urban agriculture and this movement. So Robin McPherson, you've got a question. Would you like to ask that to Walter?
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Walter. It's been great to listen to your talk. My question is, am I missing something obvious, i.e., anything I grow at home or in an urban agricultural setting would be better? Or are you able to send me in a direction, and maybe others, where we can further investigate, not by weight, but by nutritional integrity? Where do I start looking for charts and data to go,
Okay.
that means turnips instead of that? Thank you.
No, look, very good. And these are, again, the performance measures that you would want to market and reinforce and build on, right? And definitely, and look, we mustn't just say blanket things. I mean, no one's saying that everything grown in an urban situation, if you're growing it with chemicals and biocide, it has no difference from the chemicals and biocide used in industrial agriculture, right? So it's not a blanket greenwash here. But if you're growing your food naturally, right, basically in soil, using these natural processes, and whether you're biodynamic or organic, that's all, shades of, different shades of that activity. The point is that it comes down to actually the microbes, the mycorrhizal fungi, through which are really the interface between the soil, the often toxic, inert mineral soil, and the living plant and your health, right? And it's these fungal networks that are the interface, and they're massively extending throughout the soil, and they're taking up selectively, intelligently the nutrients they need, we need, and sort of, and functioning, right? Hang on, I just got it. Yep. And so that's the critical thing. And it's how that food is grown, right? And if you can grow it that way, then the question is its nutritional integrity. And yes, you can basically confirm that, right? You can confirm that. Sort of chemically. But at the end of the day, all you need to know is, yes, it was grown in this way, and you can have confidence of that integrity. So it's not that you have to do a chemical analysis of every carrot. Once you know that, yes, the carrots were grown that way, you can be confident of their nutritional integrity.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Robin. Thanks, Walter. Probably got time for perhaps one or maybe two more questions, depending on how detailed or complex they are. If anyone's got another.
Nick, I don't know if we've maybe skipped past Sarah's question, which was just up above Fiona's. So.
Oh, thanks, George. We may have done that. Sarah, you had a question.
Yes. I just wondered if you've got any suggestions about how the narrative could be changed in media and social media to bring people's attention back to food from the natural world, rather than these scary ideas of us going towards, I don't know, lab-made meat and processed plant-based burgers, which I've already noticed through my own research have a higher fat content than the meat-based burgers. So any suggestions?
Look, it's a long, difficult debate, that one. But as I mean, we've been talking about it. How do you account, document, like put the evidence for that, like that difference in quality, and how do you communicate that? How do you put the real savings and costs, both at an externality policy level, but particularly at an individual health level? How do you put that into the debate? As I talked about also, then how do you focus on some of those social values, the social capital value of eco-enterprises and empowering young people in their own businesses and activities, the community cafes and that whole local food system? What's the social multiplier value of having that vis-a-vis, the industrial sort of supermarket? So I think you have to look at every angle to say, well, look, where is there value here? Can I quantify that? And then do the comparison, right? Now, I'm not sure if that answers your questions. As far as catalyzing change, again, it's hard because, we've been talking about the organics industry, we've been talking about this for a century, hasn't it? How do they get organics recognized? But I mean, don't beat yourself up, because it is a big challenge. As I said,
is there much research out there which really digs down further than the macronutrients and micronutrients to those finite nutrients that won't be in these manufactured products that we can draw people's attention to?
Yeah, good. No, look, there is data there, but it's not normally in a form that is relevant or people can get it that way. For example, we all need selenium, right? We need very, very small amounts in the right form of selenium. If we don't have selenium, we can't have perioxidase enzymes, right?
Yeah.
If we don't have perioxidase enzymes, these are the things that kill cancer cells. Now, so it's very specific, it's very sophisticated, and yes, there's evidence, yes, deficiencies of selenium inhibit these perioxidases, therefore avoid or prevent the killing of cancer cells in XYZ experiments, right? So there's that study, but to go from that study to then communicate that to the wider public, to these trace elements are critical in your preventative health.
Yes.
That hasn't been communicated, and it's a bit difficult because it's not just one generic statement, it's specific.
Mm.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Walter. I think we've got time for one more question, and this is Emily. Emily had a question. Would you like to put that to Walter, Emily?
Yeah. Hi, Walter. Thanks for your presentation so far. It's been really interesting. I work for a business called Grow It Local, and we have a bunch of people growing their own food all over the country. And so I was wondering if there's any work I could use to kind of calculate the carbon sequestration potential of all those people at home growing their own food.
Yes, look, I mean, it depends again. What are you trying to achieve? For what purpose? If you're looking for carbon offsets credits, then obviously you're going to have to go through and look, what scheme am I trying to get credits in? What are all their criteria and what have you? So that might be, that's getting to detailed specifics, and you have to comply with that. But look, generally speaking, if we step back naturally, it's very, very simple, right? Basically, any plant that grows, or every plant that grows, is fixing carbon from the air. And basically, you can tell how much it's fixing by the weight of that plant, right? I've got so much biomass. That biomass is basically 60% carbon. And you also know that basically perhaps 30, 40% of the weight of the plant above the ground, the above part of the plant is, 30 to 40%. There's another 30% the roots, and up to 40% of carbon as root exudates getting leaked out of the roots. And that's pretty ballpark for most plants, right? So what you're seeing above the ground is, if you say 40%. And so you know how much carbon, in a sense, that plant is fixing from the air, CO2 drawdown from the air. And then you want another measure of how much of that drawn down biomass carbon actually gets sequestered in stable soil carbon, right? Rather than oxidized back to CO2, how much gets sequestered as stable soil carbon? And it's very simple, because there's only two things that can happen to that carbon. It can either oxidize to CO2 or get sequestered. And so you can measure, okay, how much respiration or how much oxidation am I having in this system? And basically, you can also measure, of course, how much sequestration, and the two should add up as a balance. And then you can also say, look, what are the management practices that I can do to minimize the oxidation and maximize the sequestration? And that's, again, the simplest of all, because basically if we over-cultivate, if we over-fertilize, use biocides, bare fallow, burning stubble, all those things in industrial agriculture, well, we're basically putting 100% of the plant carbon fixed back into the air as CO2 very rapidly. Conversely, if we don't do those negative oxidative things, but we encourage the fungi, and there's specific fungi that turn biomass into stable soil carbon, humates and glomalin, but if we can stimulate those fungi, then we can also say, look, yes, we can maximize that biomass going into stable soil carbon. So look, so that's again, simple carbon accounting in a plant system. Don't beat yourself up at the third decimal point, but if you can get 60% of the carbon that the plant has fixed from the air into stable soil carbon, which is possible, readily possible, then yeah, then you're really cooking.
Walter, thank you for that, and that's a fantastic explanation you've given there. And I think if there was a method that would be, you know, reasonably straightforward and usable for the home gardener, the kind of people that Emily and Grow It Local are working with and supporting, you know, that could be incredibly powerful. And that kind of leaps back to some of the other questions about messaging and getting traction with all this. Because, you know, what governments are, you know, very concerned about and wanting to understand how they can be effective in taking action on is really to do with reducing greenhouse emissions, of course, and being seen to take effective action on climate change. And if there's a reasonably straightforward method and technique for which the home gardener can, with some training and support, could actually apply, and then that's aggregated, then you're going to get some data that's going to be hugely powerful, I think.
Yeah,
so,
Nick, well, no troubles.
That's a great conversation to have.
Yeah, as a rule of thumb, no troubles though. Like we can simply take your weight yield on the tops, and as I said, with these different calibrations, depending on what practices is used, we can say, yep, I'm getting 10 units of weight up top, right? That means 20 units in total. Okay, 60% of that is carbon, so there's 12 units of carbon in total. And yes, if I'm using these practices, I'm getting 60% of that 12 units retaining in the soil. So I've got basically 7 tons of carbon out of the 10 tons above the ground, you know, and then you say, yes, it's plus or minus 10%. So, I mean, like that variability is always there in nature, but doesn't matter. You can then claim I'm doing 7 tons of carbon sequestration from a crop above ground doing 10 tons of biomass.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's you know, a great conversation to you know, for everybody who's involved in this space to be having with home gardeners, with local government, and also, you know, for the food movement to be having with the climate movement and in joining forces, because yeah, so often people kind of swim in their lanes and don't see the synergies. And of course, with food, there is that obvious kind of intersection, you know, and as you pointed out, the solution is what we're standing on, and also what's in our hands. So I think at that point, that very positive point, I think we will conclude the session this evening. Just like to thank you again, Walter, for a really fantastic presentation. You know, it's been a real privilege to sit and listen to, you know, the way that you've explained all this, and an incredibly, you know, positive and hopeful message, I think, that you've left us with. Certainly that's the way I'm feeling this evening, and I hope that everybody else who's you know, been fortunate enough to hear you speak this evening is also feeling that way. So on behalf of Sustain, on behalf of us all, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed, and hopefully we get the chance to have, you know, further conversations with you in the future.
Yep. Thank you very much, Nick. And on my behalf, look, thank you all, because it's you're the pioneer, innovative, urban agricultural people. Really, that's the front line. And yeah, you're the ones that should get the applause. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Walter. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. All the very best. Okay.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night now. Bye-bye.